everyone. I'm Mary Bosworth, and I'm Director of Border Criminologies and also Centre for Criminology. Thank you very much for coming along this evening to this event on introducing Manus prison theory. As you will have realised, unfortunately, the technology has not worked in the way that we were hoping it would work, which is a shame. But Omid has come up with a solution which we will try and work with. So the format is going to be that Omid will present with Behrouz, and then there will be time at the end for some questions. My colleague Francesca will now introduce the two speakers. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming to this event, and we are very happy, pleased and honored to have here two special guests. We have Behrouz Boochani, for who doesn't know yet, is an adjunct associate professor at social sciences at UNSW. He is an author and a journalist, and he was incarcerated as a political prisoner by the Australian government on Manus Island for 6 years. His book, No Family Mountains, Writing from Manus Prison, that you can find outside if you want to take a copy with you, and I strongly suggest, has won numerous awards, including the 2019 Victorian Prize for Literature. Behrouz is also a non-resident visiting scholar at the Sydney Asia Pacific Migration Centre at the University of Sydney and a visiting professor at Birkbeck University of London. He is also co-director of a feature-length film, Chauka, Please Tell Us the Time. So we are very happy to have Behrouz with us. It's an honor. And we are also very happy and pleased to have with us Omid Tofighian, who is a translator and is an adjunct lecturer in the School of Arts and Media of the UNSW, an honorary research associate for the Department of Philosophy at the University of Sydney, a faculty at Iran Academia, and a campaign manager for Why Is My Curriculum White, Australasia. So thank you so much for being here and for having this event with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you for all the work that you've done to make this happen. Thank you, Mary. Thank you for welcoming us to Oxford University. What may come across as an obstacle, this seems to be a technical difficulty, and it is, but it hasn't stopped us. And for 4.5 years of working with Behrouz, who started working 2 years before I met him. So for him, it's been over 6.5 years. Technology hasn't been an obstacle. He always found a way around it. We did that tonight, and I think, in some sense, with all of these problems, now I think everyone has an understanding or some kind of some sense of what Behrouz had to go through, locked up in the prison for all of those years, trying to get information out, trying to construct a theory, trying to challenge the detention industry, the detention regime in Australia. So in many ways, what is the way we've started is a reflection of basically the last 6.5 years. So Behrouz, welcome. It's fantastic to have you here and to engage with you, to speak with you about not just Australia's border regime, but about Manus prison theory that makes the conditions, the situation, the technologies of control, the experience that you had on Manus Island makes it global. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on this, what we are now thinking about as a global phenomenon.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I always say that the important thing is, in this context, is literature and artistic language. And in artistic language, I refer to the movie Toka Please Tell Us the Time that I made with Arash Kamboli Service and other my works. I mean that I try to describe Manus prison system and describe life inside the prison camp to take the audience and readers to the prison camp to feel us, feel the suffering, and understand the systematic torture. So, but unfortunately, I think the researchers and academic people are quite lazy, and they didn't respond to my article and my book in a way to analyze the system, a way to create a theory or understand it in a theoretical way. So that's why I, as a writer, as a novelist, I had to try to create a theoretical base to describe the system. So in fact, I'm doing something that is not my job. I already did my work as a novelist, which is describe the system and put it on the table. And it is not my duty, it is the researcher and academic duty to put it in a theoretical category and analyze the system. So that's why right now I'm saying something about, I said Manus prison theory. This actually is not my field, but I think I have to do it and I have to analyze the system in this way.
Behrouz, let's. I really want to talk about the book a lot more and talk about how you present narratives, stories, how you use literary techniques to even challenge the whole notion of theory. But before we talk about the book and also all the different layers of the book, which also include a new scholarly vision, let's talk a little bit about cinema and the language of cinema and your film project. Choka, please tell us the time, for me, was important because not only does it draw on Kurdish resistance, but it also is in touch with Manusian knowledge systems and Manusian ways of seeing the world and being in the world. Can you tell us a little bit about the connection you saw between Kurdish resistance and Kurdish heritage and the situation for Manusians?
Yeah, I think people who know me, most of people know me through the book No Friend But the Mountain. But before No Friend But the Mountains, I made that movie called The Please Tell Us the Time, which reached to some international film festivals, such as London Festival. So I actually participated in an event in UK 2 years ago, through the movie program. And I think, receiving an award in Australia create a good situation. We thought that people get attention to my words. On the other side, people forget about my work. So this movie is, I call it, it's like a twin with the book No Friend But the Mountain, which is in cinema. So I think it's very important that we look at it. And this movie is important because first, we have many shots from inside the prison camp. And this prison camp later, when they close it, they destroy it, they demolish the camp. So now that prison camp doesn't exist. And so this movie is important because we have shots from inside the prison camp. And I think for understanding this exile policy, it's very good that people who follow this story very seriously watch the movie. But I think there is some difference between the movie and the book No Friend But the Mountain, which is in the movie I had this opportunity to show more about the Kurdish cultural elements, also about and it's very anti-colonialist artwork, and you can hear that how the Manus speak about this exile policy. They speak about how Australia has used their island for political benefit. They speak about the history of colonialization that island. They speak about how the superpower in the First World War and the Second World War fought against each other and harmed each other in the island. And still, people of that island are suffering because of the war in the First World War and Second World War. And now they are suffering from this exile policy. And I think people always forget about to consider the local people and Manus people. That's why I think it's important, because we are facing a classical colonialist system, which is the Australian government obviously is using an island for its political benefit and doesn't care about what the local people and how they react, what their political ideas. It means in that distance, they completely ignore them. And they don't include them and consider them as a human that who can make decisions for themselves. So I think that is an important point. But regarding the resistance between the Kurdish resistance and Manusian resistance and our resistance in Manus Island, I think we should look at it. Personally, I use the history of resistance in Kurdistan and the knowledge of resistance in Kurdistan for my works. So sometimes I think if I wasn't a Kurdish, if I wasn't aware about the Kurdistan resistance, I couldn't challenge this system in this level and in this way. And in fact, I used the Kurdish resistance elements in my works, and just I borrow it. I borrow these elements to my work. In other side, I think there is a similarity between the resistance in Kurdistan and in Manus Island, because both of them are facing a colonialist system, and in so many ways it's very similar. Right now that I'm in New Zealand, I work and I speak with and read about the Maori, the indigenous people in New Zealand, and I can see that how it's similar. Their history is very similar to Kurdistan history. And I think everywhere the colonialist system mentality is same, and they help each other how to deprive the minorities' rights. So that's why everywhere the colonialist system think, and basic in the system and in the principles is same. And that's why I think in all of these works we should see this layer of Kurdistan resistance, also colonialist mentality that I just described it and talk about.
Before moving on to the book, Behrouz, and analysing and discussing some of the narrative features of the book, I think it's important that we engage with your vision, your cinematic vision a little bit more. Just to give everyone some context, I think it's, of course, Australia, as we know it today as a nation state, it has its origins in an offshore prison, a penal colony set up by the British Empire. And this penal colony expanded into small, or it multiplied, and there were other prisons created, such as reserves, cattle stations, and missions for Aboriginal people. Island prisons were also created off the shore of Australia, close to the shore of Australia. And then, even during World War I and World War II, people who had German background, including German Jews, Italians and Japanese, were detained indefinitely without committing a crime in similar kinds of detention centres, in similar kinds of prisons. But what's really interesting here is the way that Australia has used Manus Island as a prison since the 60s. When Indonesia gained independence and soon after invaded West Papua, West Papuan refugees fled to what we know now as Papua New Guinea and sought asylum with Australia, who was who colonised that region at the time. Now Australia exiled these asylum seekers, these people seeking asylum, to Manus Island, and to this day, and you had interactions with the people, the descendants, and from this period. To this day, many of the children and some of the people who are still alive still didn't have citizenship, still didn't have a nationality. So this relationship between Australia as an offshore prison multiplying into other forms of incarceration, particularly other island prisons. Now Christmas Island, with as a not just an immigration detention centre, but also as a prison to quarantine Australian citizens who are coming back from China right now. I think this shouldn't be underestimated, and I think part of what you're talking about in relation to the way the Manusians have been resisting, or the kind of knowledge created by Manusian people, relates to the fact that they realise, not just intellectually, historically, but also in an embodied way, viscerally, they understand the relationship between Australia as a colonial nation and its relationship to its to islands, in particular its neighbours. It's expanded its borders in this particular way. We can talk about this a little bit more, but I would really appreciate your analysis of cinema in this respect. Moving on from Choka, Please Tell Us a Time, to talk about the way that you analysed the film I, Daniel Blake, by the British director Ken Loach. In your first article that really analyses Manus prison theory, you can make a really important comparison between systems of domination and submission amongst citizens, amongst people within the borders, and what happens to people who are restricted, who are denied entry over the border.
Yeah, I think you mentioned some important points. So you mentioned West Papua, you mentioned the movie I, Daniel Blake, and you mentioned the movie Choka, Please Tell Us a Time, and you mentioned Christmas Island. And now they are using that island for just those people who are they came from China. So each of them is important, and we can discuss this and talk about it. But I want to give you the bigger picture, which is, in my perspective, Australia had produced violence and exported this violence
بفرمایید.
Yeah, I think Australia has produced violence and exported this violence to the neighbors, to Manus Island, to Nauru, and to New Zealand, and to globally. Because right now, some of the Western countries are looking at Australia as an example. Can you hear me?
یه لحظه. بفهمن. Wait. بله بگو.
I wanted to say that I would like to give you a bigger picture. That's how...
Sorry, Behrouz. Maybe battery. I don't know.
I've got batteries in my office. I'll run and get some, I guess.
ببخشید یه لحظه. نه باتری میکروفون خالی شد.
You just need a battery. I know.
Can you see the battery? Is it standing? Yeah. Oh, they're those. You'll probably get those.
Okay. بهروز اگر اجازه بدی من صحبت میکنم یک کمی بعد تا باتری رو آوردیم. Okay. I might expand on some of these ideas a little bit, and then give Behrouz more time after we've fixed the battery problem. There are a number of things that I really want to explore in relation to the book, and I think there are 4 points that I often bring up in these particular contexts, in thinking about the Manus prison theory and how it emerged out of the book. What's important here is that when Behrouz and I started working together, I was translating his articles, and from the very beginning, I could tell that there was a number of different layers, a number of different styles being incorporated into his writing. It wasn't the kind of journalism that had become commonplace or was well established in relation to documenting what was happening in Australian detention centres. So I could tell that there was a literary quality to it, but also a very strong philosophical element to it. So once I translated a number of articles, then we moved on to working on the book together. Once I started translating the book, and I became aware of what he was talking about in relation to the system, that's when I said to Behrouz, there is a particular kind of resistance that's coming out of your work and out of your stance against the Australian border regime or Australian government. There is a particular kind of positionality that can be interpreted as theory. It's not just about your writing. It's not just about your intellectual work. It's not even simply about your artistic work. It's about your way of being. It's about your way of positioning yourself or challenging the very notions of what it means to be an incarcerated refugee. So from this point on, we started to think about something called Manus prison theory. And Dishe Zendana Manus, we started to talk about the Manus prison theory. And at this point, we were starting to develop it and thinking about different ways. But what really struck me was the way Behrouz used a very special word in Farsi. And this word this phrase is transnational. I mean, it uses an Arabic term, but that term is used in Farsi, Kurdish, Turkish, in a number of different, Urdu even. So the term that Behrouz was using to talk about the system was Sistem Hakem. system. I'll explain what Behrouz meant by it and how we ended up finding a translation for this. So Behrouz's term system hakem, and as I was working on the translation, I was doing a lot of research because there was a lot I wasn't familiar with, particularly in relation to Kurdish history and intellectual traditions and literary traditions and resistance. But I could find work on these other aspects, but system hakem, I found nothing. It's unprecedented. It's basically a neologism. Behrouz created a new term to represent the system within the prison. So originally, the system hakem can be translated a number of different ways. So you could translate it as governing system, ruling system, sovereign system, oppressive system, dominating system, judging or adjudicating system, ruling system. So there are a number of different ways, but none of these terms could capture what Behrouz was trying to say, which was that what's happening in the detention centre is a form of a very peculiar and perverse kind of intersectional oppression. Here we have not just race, not just discrimination based on disability, gender-based discrimination, classism or class-based discrimination. There's also an interconnection with capitalism, with militarism, with other forms of exploitation, and in combination with that, an exploitation or a degradation of the natural environment, of the ecosystem. So there's all these different kinds of oppression working together, but what's important, and to move forward from an intersectional theory, is that this particular system is bent on submission. So not just domination and oppression, but its objective, its purpose, its goal is simply just to make people submit, grind people into submission. And it's satisfied with that very phenomenon. But because this kind of violence is insatiable, once it's crushed someone into submission, the victims into submission, then it multiplies. It creates subgroups. It enables the people who have already been forced into submission, who've been annihilated by this system. It then creates possibilities for them to continue and expand and reproduce similar kinds of violence, either on themselves, reproduce it again on themselves, or on the people who they're incarcerated with. What's even more fascinating about this is that there is a close connection between the multiplication of this kind of intersectional violence and Australian society and institutions and political systems. So there's this also this dynamic between the two islands, Australia and Manus Island. The only word I could think of to translate system hakem was originally I started translating it as oppressive system, but I was never satisfied with this because it wasn't really explaining or reflecting this particular kind of violence that he was talking about, this very complex system within the prison, multi-dimensional system. So I went back to an example of a radical feminist theologian from my own research years ago, and Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza creates a whole new term in the 90s called kyriarchy. And kyriarchy, it comes from the Greek word master or overlord. So we created a new term, a new phrase in English to represent a new term in Farsi, and that was the kyriarchal system. And it's this kyriarchal system that's one of the pillars of Manus prison theory. And we can discuss that in more detail, but the only way that Behrouz was able to reflect and introduce this and draw people into the prison in order to understand it, to recognise the kind of situation that they were in, the lived experience, was to construct narratives, really complex narratives to analyse and expose the kyriarchal system. Behrouz, I'll let you continue now.
I think it's very important that we look at the bigger picture, which is that how Australia produce violence and exported this violence to Manus Island, to North Island, to Papua New Guinea, to New Zealand, and then to globally, because many countries look at Australia as an example, and it is going to be reality in other countries. Already, some of the countries like Denmark did. So it is a very ugly pattern for globally. So we should look at this. That whole Australia. I'm talking about the first question that you mentioned about the movie and the local people. Australia, right now, I think, if I be a New Zealander, and if I write as a New Zealand citizen, I mean, if I be in their position, I write about this, that we should protect New Zealand from Australia. Because this political culture in Australia is broken, and now it's getting worse, and it has impact on other countries, such as New Zealand. And so that's why I think Australia is the biggest threat for the region, the Pacific region, and also it's very negative pattern for other countries. And look at Australia and use this each-side policy. But what I want to say is that right now that we are talking about it, the recent thing that happened in Australia is that the Australian government is going to send those people who come from China to Christmas Island.
Actually, they're already there, Behrouz. They are already there now.
Pardon?
They are already there.
Yeah, they are there. Yeah. What I want to say is that it seems that it is the part of Australian mentality that anything that happens in this country, the first thing they think about is to just export this, problem. And they think that they don't have a plan and they cannot think how to fix this, and I think that comes from the history of colonialization in Australia and the way they have been treating the indigenous people and Aboriginal people in Australia, and later to the refugees, and now still they are treating the indigenous people in that way. But the whole this story is that it's like creating knowledge in Australia, and Australian government established its Manus Island, Manus prison system, Northern prison system, on base of this knowledge. That this knowledge has been developed over the past century, and also borrowed the elements and knowledge from other concentration camps, other places, like Guantanamo and other prison camps. So the whole picture is this. So when I talk about the Manus prison system, of course, I should talk about the Manusian people. I should talk about the local people, because they are the main part of this story. And in any way, we talk about only refugees there. And if we just talk about the human rights, we cannot create change, we cannot create a new space to understand this system. So all of these are same, and they are relate to each other. Malaysian people, local people, the way Australia treat them, the indigenous people, the history of Australia, and now the refugee. So the whole picture is this, and we should talk about this. But in the movie, it was a good opportunity. I told this. So the movie actually has a story. I would like to tell this story about the movie. The movie has 4 stories. That in the end of the movie, come together. First story is solitary confinement. And Australia, the system keep the detainees there and torture them there. And they name this solitary confinement choka. Exactly, choka is the name of a bird, native bird in Manus Island. And this bird is only lives in Manus Island. Even you cannot see it in other parts of Papua New Guinea. Only in Manus Island, and the symbol of this island, and it's the symbol of their flag. And people has respect to this bird, and it actually they found the custom, choka custom. So in this context, we have two stories. Which one is a beautiful story, which is the choka bird, and how is respectful bird for local people, and in other side, an ugly choka, which is a solitary confinement that they torture for death, and which is for Australia, and they name it choka. So it's been, I think this story in this movie showed the mentality of colonializations in Australia, and how really Australia thinks about, because they do this in a very inhuman way, they do it in a very disrespectful way, and in fact, they name this solitary confinement, they borrowed and they name it choka. It's exactly the symbol of Manusian culture. So I think it is a very surreal picture. It's very surreal picture, and can be represent the whole story.
Can I just add something to that, Behrouz? I think it's important as well that choka is a bird that tells the Manusian people the time. It calls at 6:30 in the morning to indicate that it's time to start your day, and at 6:30 in the afternoon it calls again to let people know that it's time to move on to another part of the day. And so it represents not just their identity, it's not just part of their moral and social fabric, but also it's a timekeeper. It's a symbol of time. But for the refugees locked up in the detention center, it represents stolen time or no time, and indicates that time is being used in this case as torture.
Yeah, choka has many different meanings for local people. The first one, the real one is time. Choka is telling time. But in other side, tell actually spread news, and that's why the Manusian radio, the local radio, named it choka. Because choka is telling news, talking with people, and has many different meanings. Choka tell truth. Talk about the birth. Talk about many things, and the elders, understand and interpret. They are interpreting the choka, what the choka say, choka voice to the community. And they have a very strong connection to people. And but about the time, I think the reason that we use this title, that choka plays the last of time. In the book, you can see that choka is important character. So I think time in indefinite detention, in indefinite prison, is very important and is the main part of the systematic torture, because they keep people there And the trainees don't know how long they should stay in that prison camp. How many years they want to keep them there? How many years? How long it will take? And that is important, because when you are in a prison and you know that you should stay in prison for 10 years, 5 years, I think it's different. When you are in a prison camp and you think that you will be free in 1 month, and then another month, another year, it takes 6 years, 7 years, and actually people in that prison camp are, suffering and are struggling with time. And it is the main part. So I think, we can talk about this. We can talk about the tropical area. Actually,
Behrouz, I think something that you said, especially in relation to Choka, its way of representing knowledge, spreading knowledge, its relationship to being and knowing, and also doing for the Manusian people. Maybe we can expand on this to talk about how your relationship with the land, with the ecosystem, with nature from Kurdistan, how that provided the foundation, or one element of the foundation for your resistance. I remember when I called you a number of times when the reception was strong in Manus Island, and I called you, I think it was about 6:30 in the afternoon, and as I was calling you, we could hear Choka in the background. And I think there was one case when I called to give you some new news. It was news that was the cause of for joy or for celebrating. It was something important that I had to convey to you at that time. And you said to me, Choka sounds different today. Omid, he's saying hello to you. I'll never forget this. I'll never forget that. And you then, at other times, you told me that Choka is saying something else, or doing something different. And this is something that you told me the Manusian people do. They interpret the way Choka calls. And that interpretation is based in traditions, customs, practices, and, of course, a very deep ontological connection with the land. I'm really... Because the relationship with nature, the interpretation of nature in your book is so powerful. And I think often when criticizing the detention industry, it's based on the exploitation and the deterioration of bodies, the degradation of people's souls and identity. But the element or the feature that relates to the destruction of the land, of the water, of the ecosystem isn't talked about enough. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about your connection with nature back in Kurdistan, but also maybe expand on that to talk about how you use that as a form of resistance and how it enabled you to criticize the system, the detention industry, in a more multi-layered way, in a more powerful way?
Yeah, I think I should mention this, that when they say that Choka today is going to say something, but not a big claim, because I'm not an elder. So just I say that, I mean, to connect with Choka, of course I cannot understand, like the elders, that what Choka is saying. So it was only a funny moment. I think nature in this context is very important, and that's why in all of my work, particularly in this book, No Friend But the Mountain, you can see that there are many natural elements in the book and in our life, and how there is like a conflict between the prison system and the nature. And nature always try to push the prison system back. And the prison system try to the nature back. So there are many elements. Sometimes I talk about snakes, about the traps that they come to the prison system. And I describe the bell, I describe the coconut trees, I describe the many natural elements in the book. So it's very important because we rely on nature, and that's why we survive. Of course, the system don't make all seriously, and 8 people were killed by this system, Manus prison system, and 5 in Nauru, but we survive because we rely on the nature. And this, I think, the way that I understand the nature is, of course, real written to my background at the court, because Kurdistan nature has a important role on our cultural elements like food, language, and it's written to my background. Most of the time, I'm actually born in nature and grew up in the nature. So I try, but I think I should mention the chapter 8 in the book. That is, in that chapter, the prisoners are starving and they are sitting from the mango tree, mango fruit, and there is a competition between the birds, crabs, and humans, and ants. There is a competition to get the mango fruit. And I think that part is remarkable because the human become a part of the nature, become a part of the ecosystem, become a part of the ecosystem. And we are not separate from the ecosystem, we are not separate from the nature. And I think that chapter is very important, that how human is an animal, like other animals. And in end of the movie, the book, the last sentence of the book, Toka bird is flying with Behrouz, which is one of the main characters in the book. And that shows human and nature we should understand them together in a respectful way, and they become together and they become one. And in this world that we are living, you can see that the indigenous people and the way indigenous people respect the land and have connection to land, and know how to use the nature and rely on the nature is a big and important pattern for this global, climate change, this global crisis. But unfortunately, it happens in this debate, the debate around the environment and about climate change. It's very important. These days, we look at the indigenous people, for example, the Aboriginal people in Australia, that for thousands of years, they have and how to use the land. But now Australia is facing bushfire and so problems. So, I mean, it's important that we ask this question that all these people use the land and have connected to the land or connected to the land. So all of this, I think, is important in that context. Yeah. So we can use it, we can borrow it, and explain other problems globally.
That was really beautiful and inspiring, and I think this is probably a good time to go to questions, to invite questions. But if it's okay, if you don't mind, Behrouz, I just wanted to add to that because just one small point. There was another time that we were discussing this connection with nature and its relationship with resistance, and you told me that one of the things that helped inspire refugees to fight, continue fighting, to develop new ways of thinking and standing against this regime, was to actually find a new sense of time or a new rhythm or a new tempo by understanding nature in the natural environment on Manus Island. So in a way, nature offered opportunities to the prisoners to create a new sense of time. And I think it's important that the chapter you're talking about, Reza Barotti, the first person to be killed in Manus Island, in Manus prison, his name is connected to the mango tree. So part of the title of that chapter is The Magnificent Mango Tree and the Gentle Giant.
I think so I want to say one thing. That sometimes I am in another prison and they torture us in this way, they keep us in this systematic, bureaucratic, torture. We couldn't survive. We survived, I think, only because of the nature. Because of the tropical nature. Because the nature was an element that they couldn't ignore it. They cut many trees inside the prison camp, but still we could hear the voice of the ocean. Still we could hear the voice of the birds, and they didn't control of them. We could see the coconut trees. So, I mean, we couldn't survive if they would keep us in a very, ببخش کلمه‌اش یادم.
میخوای پرسش و پاسخ شروع میکنیم بهروز؟
Yeah,
okay. Unfortunately, Behrouz, we have to wrap it up. What can I say, Behrouz? Once again, that was a really enlightening and really special moment. Thank you for producing these new ways of seeing and also new ways of challenging. Well, thank you for giving us your book. Thank you for giving us your film and your thoughts. So we will definitely continue this conversation.